So today's video is basically photos with disturbing backstories, but it's about a time when cameras didn't exist, and instead of capturing a photo, people just painted stuff. And just like the photographs, some of these paintings are normal looking but aren't. Some are final paintings, and others are straight up eerie with backstories, which are even more disturbing than what appears on the surface. So the painting I thought would be a good start for this video is actually a very normal looking one. I even looked at it years ago and thought, oh, how serene and beautiful. But just like I did, you too will soon know that its backstory is anything but normal. It's The Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth. At first glance, it looks like a peaceful, almost dreamlike scene. A young woman in a pink dress lies in a vast field of golden grass, gazing toward a distant farmhouse and barn. The image feels nostalgic, evoking a sense of solitude and quiet contemplation. But the reality behind the painting is much darker. The woman in the field is Christina Olsen, a real person who suffered from a severe neuromuscular disease that left her unable to walk. Instead of using a wheelchair, she dragged herself across the ground, and that's exactly what Wyeth captured in this haunting image. The painting was inspired by Wyeth's visits to the Olsen family home in Cushing, Maine. Christina Olsen lived there with her brother, and despite her physical limitations, she refused to rely on modern assistance like a wheelchair. Instead, she moved around the farm by crawling with her arms, pulling her body along the ground. Wyeth, who was fascinated by her resilience, watched her from a window one day as she struggled through the grass, and that moment became the basis for Christina's world. What makes this painting so unsettling is how subtly it reveals its deeper meaning. At first, it looks almost serene, but when you realize that Christina isn't just resting in the field, she's struggling to move, it completely changes the way you see the image. The vastness of the landscape emphasizes her isolation. The house in the distance, which seems so close at first, suddenly feels impossibly far away. The uneven textured grass adds to the sense of difficulty, making it clear that reaching the house would be an exhausting effort for her. Wyeth deliberately chose not to paint Christina's face in detail. Her head is turned away from the viewer, leaving only her dark hair and outstretched arms visible. This makes it impossible to see her expression. Instead, Wyeth focused on the details of her body, her thin arms, her slightly twisted posture, to hint at her condition without making it overly obvious. The choice of a pink dress, usually associated with softness and femininity, contrasts sharply with the harsh reality of her struggle. Many people who see Christina's World for the first time mistake it for a peaceful or even romantic image. It has been reproduced countless times as a symbol of rural American life, but those who learn the real story behind it often find it deeply unsettling. It's not a painting about freedom or relaxation. It's about perseverance, loneliness, and physical hardship. The Killer Clown's artwork. John Wayne Gacy was one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, responsible for the murders of at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. By day, Gacy was an active community member, even performing as Pogo the Clown at children's parties. By night, he carried out his gruesome crimes, luring victims to his home, torturing them, and burying many of them in the crawlspace beneath his house. After his arrest and conviction, Gacy spent his years on death row painting eerie and unsettling artwork. Many of his paintings depicted clowns, including his alter ego, Pogo. The piece in question, often called Pogo the Clown with the Seven Dwarfs, is a haunting example. It shows a clown, Gacy himself, dressed in red and white stripes, surrounded by sorrowful dwarfs. The exaggerated frown and dark, hollow eyes make it an unsettling image, seemingly mocking innocence. Collectors and true crime enthusiasts have bought, sold, and even burned Gacy's paintings over the years. Few paintings in modern history have caused as much public outrage as Myra by Marcus Harvey. At first glance, it looks like a grainy black and white portrait of a woman with piercing eyes and a cold expression. But when you step closer, the unsettling truth becomes clear. The entire image is made up of thousands of children's handprints. The woman in the painting is Myra Hindley, one of Britain's most infamous serial killers, responsible for the Moors murders, a series of horrific crimes in the 1960s. Hindley, along with her partner Ian Brady, kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 5 children between 1963 and 1965. The crimes shocked the UK, not only because of their brutality, but because Hindley was a woman. Her mugshot with her pale face and bleached blonde hair became a symbol of pure evil in British culture. That infamous image is the one Harvey recreated in his painting, but with a disturbing twist. The choice to use children's handprints as the medium was no accident. Harvey deliberately made the painting out of the very thing Hindley and Brady had taken: innocent lives. When Myra was first displayed at the Royal Academy of Art's Sensation exhibition in 1997, the public reaction was explosive. People were horrified that an image of Hindley was being shown in an art gallery, especially in such a provocative way. Many saw it as deeply offensive, a glorification of a monster. The painting was vandalized multiple times by enraged viewers. One person threw ink at it, while others attacked it with eggs and even punched the canvas. The damage was so severe that it had to be temporarily removed for repairs before being put back on display. The controversy wasn't just about the painting itself. It also sparked a larger debate about what art should and shouldn't do. Some argued that Harvey was exploiting the pain of the victims' families for shock value. Others believed that Myra was a powerful statement about crime, media, and society's obsession with infamous figures. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Beata Beatrix is a hauntingly ethereal tribute to his wife and muse, Elizabeth Siddal, whose tragic death cast a long shadow over his life and art. Elizabeth Siddal was the ultimate pre-Raphaelite muse. Her delicate features, long red hair, and melancholic beauty were immortalized in numerous paintings, most famously as Ophelia by John Everett Millais. However, her life was far from the romanticized ideal portrayed in art. She suffered from chronic illness, depression, and a growing dependence on laudanum, an opium-based painkiller. Rossetti, though deeply in love with her, was often neglectful, and their turbulent relationship was marred by his affairs and emotional distance. In 1862, just 2 years after they married, Elizabeth was found dead from an overdose of laudanum, possibly intentional, leaving Rossetti shattered by guilt and remorse. In Beata Beatrix, Rossetti transforms Elizabeth into Beatrice Portinari, the muse of Dante Alighieri, who died young and was later immortalized in La Vita Nuova and the Divine Comedy. Like Dante's Beatrice, Siddal is depicted in a trance-like state, caught between life and death. Her head tilts back, eyes closed, as if surrendering to fate. A red dove, symbolizing love but also death, delivers a poppy into her open hands, a clear reference to the opium that killed her. In the background, shadowy figures of Dante and an angel watch over the scene. Rossetti's grief was all-consuming. In a dramatic and impulsive act, he buried the only manuscript of his unpublished poems with Elizabeth's body, a gesture of ultimate devotion, or guilt. However, years later, haunted by financial troubles and literary ambition, he had her body exhumed to retrieve the poems. The act was scandalous and deeply unsettling, and Rossetti never fully recovered from the guilt of disturbing her rest. He spiraled into addiction and mental illness, becoming increasingly paranoid and tormented by visions of Elizabeth. The Hands Resist Him was painted by Bill Stoneham in 1972 and has since become one of the most infamous pieces of allegedly haunted artwork. The painting was originally created as part of a contract with a gallery owner in California, inspired by a childhood photograph of Stoneham and a poem written by his wife. The artwork depicts a young boy standing next to a life-sized doll with hollow eyes and jointed limbs, positioned in front of a glass-paneled door. Behind the glass, a series of disembodied hands press forward, as if desperate to break through. The painting first gained notoriety in 2000 when a California couple listed it on eBay, claiming it carried a disturbing presence. According to their description, the figures in the painting would move at night. The most unsettling claim suggested that the boy would actually exit the canvas, wandering the room as if trying to escape the doll. The listing, which included photographs allegedly showing evidence of this phenomenon, went viral, attracting widespread attention and turning the painting into an internet legend. Even before its online infamy, The Hands Resist Him had eerie associations. The first gallery owner to display the painting, Charles Feingarten, and the first art critic to review it, Henry Seldes of the Los Angeles Times, both died within a year of encountering the piece. While no direct connection can be proven, these deaths have fueled speculation that the painting is cursed. The painting was ultimately purchased on eBay by a gallery owner in Michigan, who has since refused to sell it despite numerous offers. Stoneham himself has acknowledged the painting's reputation, but maintains that it was never intended to be anything more than a surreal exploration of childhood. Theodore Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa is not just a masterpiece of romanticism, it is a harrowing depiction of human suffering, desperation, and survival at its most grotesque. The painting is based on the real-life tragedy of the French naval frigate Medusa, which ran aground off the coast of Senegal in 1816 due to the incompetence of its captain, an aristocrat appointed through political favoritism rather than skill. While the higher-ranking officers escaped on lifeboats, 147 men were abandoned on a makeshift raft and left to drift at sea. For 13 horrifying days, the survivors endured starvation, dehydration, insanity, and brutal violence. As their numbers dwindled, they resorted to cannibalism, feeding on the dead to stay alive. Only 15 of them were rescued when a passing ship finally spotted the raft. By then, they were little more than living corpses, ravaged by hunger and madness. News of the disaster caused a national scandal in France, exposing the corruption and incompetence within the government and military. Géricault became obsessed with the story, determined to immortalize its horrors on canvas. His research was disturbingly thorough. He interviewed survivors to capture their trauma firsthand, visited morgues to study decomposing bodies, and even smuggled severed limbs and heads into his studio. He painted with feverish intensity, pouring his own mental and physical anguish into the work. His methods took a severe toll on his health, both physically and psychologically. The painting itself is a masterpiece of despair. It depicts the moment when the survivors, barely clinging to life, spot a distant ship on the horizon. Some figures raise their arms in desperate hope, while others lie lifeless, consumed by exhaustion and death. The composition is chaotic yet precise, guiding the viewer's eye from the corpses at the bottom to the figures at the top, desperately waving for rescue. The contrast between hope and hopelessness makes the painting even more devastating. Help is within sight, but will it come in time? Géricault's obsession with death did not go unnoticed. Friends and family grew concerned as he descended further into darkness. His relentless work on the Raft of the Medusa likely contributed to his early demise. He suffered from severe depression, possibly exacerbated by the infections he contracted from handling corpses. At just 32 years old, he died after a long, painful illness, leaving behind a legacy tainted by the very horrors he sought to depict. Elia Repin's painting Ivan the Terrible and his son, Ivan, is one of the most haunting and controversial artworks in Russian history. The painting depicts the moment after Tsar Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, struck his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, in a fit of rage, mortally wounding him. The raw emotion in the painting, from Ivan IV's wide, terror-stricken eyes to the lifeless gaze of his son, captures an event that not only defined a ruler's downfall, but also altered the course of Russian history. According to historical accounts, on November 16, 1581, an argument erupted between Ivan the Terrible and his son. The exact cause is debated, but one widely accepted version suggests that the conflict started when the Tsar physically assaulted his pregnant daughter-in-law, Yelena Sheremeteva, for wearing immodest clothing. His son, Ivan Ivanovich, intervened to defend her. In a fit of uncontrolled fury, Ivan IV struck his son on the head with his staff, often described as a scepter with a metal tip. The blow proved fatal, and the younger Ivan died a few days later. The Tsar, realizing what he had done, was consumed by grief. Witnesses described him as wailing in agony and attempting to save his son, but it was too late. His heir's death left Russia without a competent successor, paving the way for the disastrous Time of Troubles, a period of political chaos, famine, and foreign invasions that nearly destroyed the Russian state. Repin's painting captures the precise moment when Ivan IV, overwhelmed by horror and regret, cradles his dying son in his arms. The details are chilling. His wide, bloodshot eyes are filled with shock and remorse, as if he is unable to comprehend what he has done. His fingers grip his son's lifeless body in desperation. Ivan Ivanovich's face is eerily calm, his eyes already losing focus. Blood stains his temple. The dimly lit room and dark red tones add to the painting's somber, almost suffocating atmosphere. From the moment of its unveiling in 1885, Ivan the Terrible and his son, Ivan, stirred controversy. The painting was seen as an attack on Russian autocracy, indirectly criticizing the brutality of rulers. Tsar Alexander III despised it, banning it from public display for a time. In 1913, a disturbed viewer slashed the painting with a knife, damaging Ivan Ivanovich's face. Repin, despite being elderly, personally helped restore it. But the painting suffered another attack in 2018 when a man, believing it was historically inaccurate, smashed the protective glass and tore the canvas. Despite these attacks, the painting remains one of Russia's most powerful and unsettling works, not only for its gruesome depiction of a father's fatal rage, but for the tragic historical consequences that followed. The Crying Boy is one of the most infamous cursed paintings, linked to a series of unexplained disasters. In the 1950s, Italian artist Giovanni Bragolin, also known as Bruno Amadio, created a series of portraits featuring tearful children. The most famous among them is The Crying Boy, an image of a young child with sorrowful eyes and a single tear rolling down his cheek. These paintings were mass-produced and widely sold throughout Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom, where they became a common household decoration. The painting's reputation took a dark turn in 1985 when The Sun, a British tabloid, published a shocking article titled "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy." The story detailed a disturbing pattern. Numerous house fires had occurred in homes where copies of the Crying Boy were displayed. Firefighters reported that while entire rooms were reduced to ashes, the paintings themselves were often found eerily intact, seemingly untouched by the flames. This led to widespread fear that the artwork was cursed, and many people rushed to dispose of their copies. Theories about the painting's alleged curse vary. Some believe Bragolin painted orphans whose tragic fates became embedded in the artwork. Others speculate that a grieving spirit is attached to the painting, bringing misfortune to anyone who owns it. More skeptical explanations suggest that the prints were coated with a fire-resistant varnish, which may have contributed to their survival in house fires. Despite its decline in popularity after the 1985 media frenzy, The Crying Boy remains a subject of fascination. Some still claim the curse lingers, affecting anyone who dares to keep it on their walls. One of the most intricate and haunting paintings ever created is The Fairy Feller's Masterstroke by Richard Dadd. At first glance, it looks like a mesmerizing fantasy scene, a dense, almost overwhelming collection of tiny, carefully detailed figures frozen in an otherworldly moment. But the story behind it is far darker than its magical appearance suggests. Richard Dadd was a brilliant artist known for his obsessive attention to detail and fantastical style. However, he struggled deeply with mental illness, something that would ultimately define both his life and his work. In 1842, Dadd embarked on a grand tour across Europe and the Middle East. But during his travels, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He began experiencing severe delusions and paranoia, believing that he was being controlled by supernatural forces. His condition worsened after returning to England, and soon he became convinced that his own father was possessed by the devil. In a tragic turn, these delusions drove him to take his father's life in 1843. He was quickly arrested and declared insane, leading to his confinement in Bethlehem Royal Hospital, an institution infamous for housing the mentally ill and commonly referred to as Bedlam. Rather than abandoning art, however, Dadd continued to paint while institutionalized, creating some of his most detailed and fascinating works. Among them was The Fairy Feller's Masterstroke, a painting he worked on for years, commissioned by a hospital official. The artwork is an explosion of fine detail, depicting a strange and mystical world filled with tiny figures, all gathered to witness the central moment, a fairy woodsman about to split a hazelnut with his axe. However, the painting was never completed. Before he could finish it, Dad was transferred to Broadmoor Asylum, where he would spend the rest of his life. Looking closely at the painting, unsettling details emerge. The fairy feller, the axe-wielding figure at the center, bears a striking resemblance to Dad himself. Some believe this was intentional, a subconscious reflection of his own violent past, hidden within his fantastical world. Hungarian painter Tivadar Sántváry Kostka is often called a mad genius of the art world. His 1902 work, The Old Fisherman, looks simple at first, a weathered man staring solemnly at the sea, but hidden in its brushstrokes is a secret. Sántváry, who began painting in his 40s after claiming divine visions, believed he was destined to rival masters like Michelangelo. But his obsession with spiritual symbolism and worsening mental health led to eerie, unsettling works. The Old Fisherman is famous for its double image. When split down the middle and mirrored, the left half transforms into a gaunt demonic figure, while the right half resembles a serene, saintly face. Critics debate whether this duality was intentional, a commentary on humanity's good-evil nature, or a subconscious reflection of Sántváry's fractured mind. The artist grew increasingly paranoid, convinced enemies were sabotaging his career, and died in poverty, dismissed as a madman. This unsettling artwork is part of a series by Polish painter Zdzisław Beksiński, whose entire career revolved around capturing the kind of haunting, surreal imagery that feels ripped straight from a nightmare. No title, no explanation, just a bleak, almost alien landscape that leaves viewers feeling deeply uneasy. People who've stood in front of it often describe a heavy, oppressive energy, as if the painting itself is radiating something off. But here's where it gets chilling. Beksiński's obsession with death seemed to follow him into real life. In 1998, his wife Zofia died after a battle with cancer. A year later, his son Tomasz, who'd struggled with depression, died by suicide. Beksiński's son Tomasz left a suicide note that read, "Life is not for me." The artist kept it in his wallet until his own death. Then, in 2005, Beksiński's own life ended in violence. A 19-year-old acquaintance, enraged after Beksiński refused to lend him money, stabbed the artist 17 times in his Warsaw apartment. The painting's reputation only grew darker after his death. Museum staff and visitors swear it feels alive in the creepiest way possible. Some even say that staring at it too long invites bad luck or death itself, though that might just be its grim backstory messing with people's heads. What many don't know is that Beksiński's dark vision was shaped by survival. He grew up in Nazi-occupied Poland during World War II, an experience that left him with a lifelong fascination with decay and chaos. Yet he hated when critics tried to decode his work. "I paint as if I were photographing dreams," he'd say, shrugging off deeper meanings. And while his paintings feel apocalyptic, they're also weirdly beautiful, hyper-detailed, almost like a dark Renaissance masterpiece. Every wrinkle, shadow, and twisted form is rendered with obsessive precision. Even in his final years, Beksiński refused to leave Warsaw despite threats from the teenager who'd later kill him. It's as if he'd accepted the darkness that stalked his life and art. The Anguished Man is one of the most mysterious and allegedly haunted paintings in existence. Little is known about its history before 1985, when a woman from northern England acquired it. She believed the painting carried an evil presence and kept it stored away. After her passing, the unsettling artwork was inherited by her grandson, Sean Robinson, who began to piece together its dark history through his grandmother's warnings and his own chilling experiences. According to the stories surrounding the painting, the unknown artist who created the Anguished Man mixed his own blood into the paint before completing the disturbing image, a grotesque, screaming face engulfed in red and orange tones. It is said that the artist took his own life immediately after finishing the piece, leaving behind no record of his identity or the painting's purpose. Not long after Robinson brought the artwork into his home, his family began experiencing unexplainable phenomena. They reported hearing faint cries and agonized moans emanating from the painting at night. A dark, shadowy figure was seen in their house on multiple occasions, often appearing in their peripheral vision before vanishing. These unsettling events escalated, with objects moving on their own and a sense of unease pervading the home. Seeking to document the strange activity, Robinson recorded several videos in which the painting appeared to shift position on its own, further fueling speculation that the Anguished Man is haunted. Many believe that the tormented spirit of its creator lingers within the canvas, forever trapped in the image he painted in his final moments. Despite the fear it instills, Robinson has refused to destroy or sell the painting, keeping it locked away, but still in his possession. At first glance, Unequal Marriage by Vasily Pukirev seems like just another 19th century wedding scene, but a closer look reveals a deeply unsettling reality. This painting isn't a celebration of love, it's an indictment of an unjust tradition. Pukirev, a man from humble beginnings, used his art to expose the uncomfortable truths about wealth, power, and forced unions. But why did he make it so infuriating? Because this time, it was personal. The scene unfolds in a dimly lit church where a young bride stands under a soft glow of light, her delicate frame draped in white, adorned with flowers and fine jewelry. Yet there's no joy in her expression, only sorrow. Her red-rimmed eyes and slumped posture betray the overwhelming grief she's struggling to suppress. Her grip on the ceremonial candle is so weak that one might wonder if she's moments away from dropping it, letting the flames consume everything around her. Beside her stands the groom, if you can call him that. He is stiff, lifeless, almost corpse-like. His body is as rigid as the candle he holds, his face void of love or warmth. He doesn't look at his bride with admiration or tenderness, only with cold detachment. The medals on his chest signal his status, his wealth, his power. But in this moment, they only serve to highlight the brutal transaction taking place. This isn't a wedding, it's a business deal. The young girl is the asset exchanged for wealth and security, her future decided by others. And then in the background there's a familiar figure, a man standing with his arms crossed, glaring at the groom with pure contempt. This is Vasily Pukirev himself. He didn't just paint this scene, he lived it. The woman in the painting, she was the love of his life, forced to marry an older, wealthier man because Pukirev, a struggling artist, wasn't considered a suitable match. Years later, records show that the real-life bride, Praskovia Matveyevna Vorontsova, ended up alone, living in poverty, proof that this so-called better match led only to misery. But the eerie details don't stop there. Behind the groom's shoulder, two ghostly women linger. They wear white, their faces filled with a knowing dread. Are they past brides, forever trapped in the cycle of these loveless unions, or are they a dark omen of the bride's fate? To make things even stranger, early sketches of the painting depict a different man in Pukirev's place. Some believe this was a friend of the artist who suffered a similar heartbreak, watching a woman he loved choose wealth over love. When this piece was unveiled, it shook society. It resonated so deeply that, according to legend, wealthy older men began canceling their marriages to young brides, afraid of being seen as the villain in Pukirev's masterpiece. There are plenty of unsettling paintings throughout history, but one painting stands out from the rest. Francisco Goya's Saturn Devouring His Son. At first glance, it's pure nightmare fuel, a grotesque, wild-eyed figure frozen mid-act as he tears apart a lifeless body. But the story behind it makes it even more disturbing. The painting depicts the Greek titan Cronus, or Saturn, in Roman mythology, who, after overthrowing his father, received a chilling prophecy. One of his own children would do the same to him. Desperate to prevent this, Cronus swallowed each of his offspring whole as soon as they were born. But his wife, Rhea, managed to save their youngest, Zeus, who would later rise up and fulfill the prophecy, overthrowing his father and ending the reign of the Titans. But Goya's version of the myth takes a darker turn. Unlike the traditional story, where Cronus simply swallows his children alive, Goya paints an image of sheer brutality. His Saturn doesn't just consume, he butchers. Inspired in part by Peter Paul Rubens's earlier depiction of the same myth, Goya strips away any elegance or restraint. The Baroque richness of Rubens' painting is gone. Instead, we see a monstrous, maddened figure in a chaotic, desperate frenzy. His mouth is already stained red, and the figure in his grasp is lifeless. Saturn's hands clutch tightly, his fingers pressing into the body as if he's lost all control, driven by a terrifying, primal instinct. And if you look closely, you'll notice something even more chilling. This isn't the body of an infant. Goya's Saturn is devouring an adult. The prophecy has already come true. The child had time to grow, to resist, to understand what was happening. And yet, it wasn't enough. But the disturbing backstory doesn't stop with the image itself. It's more about where it was found. This wasn't painted on a canvas for public viewing. It was one of the black paintings, a series of 14 nightmarish murals Goya painted directly onto the walls of his home. And this one, it was in the dining room. Goya never spoke of them, never titled them, never intended for anyone to see them. He painted them in total isolation in his final years, his mind and body deteriorating. Once a celebrated court painter, he had become deaf, disillusioned, and haunted by the horrors of war and the collapse of Spain's progress. The once promising future had been devoured, just like Saturn's son. So what was this painting to Goya? A reflection of his own madness, a vision of a country eating itself alive, or simply a raw, unfiltered expression of fear, power, and destruction? We'll never know, because Goya didn't care how we interpret it. He didn't paint it for us. And maybe that's what makes it so terrifying. The Lovers 2, René Magritte. At first glance, René Magritte's The Lovers 2 appears to depict a romantic scene, a couple locked in an intimate kiss. But the unsettling detail is impossible to ignore. Their faces are completely covered by white cloth, creating a sense of disconnection. While he never confirmed a personal meaning behind the recurring imagery of shrouded faces in his work, many believe it stems from a deeply traumatic event in his childhood. When he was just 14, his mother tragically drowned after struggling with severe mental distress for years. It wasn't her first attempt, and in the past, her husband had even resorted to locking her in a room to prevent her from harming herself. When her body was recovered, her nightgown had drifted over her face, obscuring it from view, a haunting image that his younger self likely never forgot. Throughout his career, he repeatedly painted figures with concealed faces, possibly reflecting themes of grief, detachment, or the unknowability of others. He deliberately left his works open to interpretation, famously stating that his paintings evoke mystery rather than provide clear meaning. Some suggest The Lovers 2 represents the idea that love is blind, while others see it as a portrayal of emotional barriers and hidden sorrow. Self-Portrait with Bandaged Ear, Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh is one of the most celebrated painters in history, but his artistic brilliance was accompanied by severe mental struggles. His self-portrait with bandaged ear is not just a depiction of himself. It represents one of the most infamous and disturbing episodes of his life. In late 1888, he was living in Arles, France, hoping to create an artist's retreat with fellow painter Paul Gauguin. However, their friendship was volatile, marked by constant arguments and his increasingly erratic behavior. One night, after a heated confrontation, he suffered a severe mental breakdown. In a fit of distress, he reportedly threatened Gauguin with a razor before turning it on himself, slicing off a portion of his own left ear. He then wrapped the severed piece and presented it to a woman working at a local brothel. The gruesome gift reportedly caused her to faint, while he disappeared into the night before returning home, dazed and covered in blood. The next morning, he was found in his room, unresponsive, with no memory of the event. While he painted many self-portraits, this particular one stands out because of the visible bandage covering his ear, serving as both a physical and symbolic reminder of his struggles. Notably, the wound appears on his right ear in the painting, but this is due to him using a mirror while painting. Some art historians interpret the piece as a reflection of his psychological torment, isolation, and the toll of his deteriorating mental health. Others see it as his attempt to reclaim control over his identity and suffering by immortalizing it in art. Despite his personal hardships, he continued to paint until his untimely death in 1890. His work, once dismissed during his lifetime, is now considered some of the most influential in art history. The Black Triptychs. Francis Bacon was known for his raw, unsettling paintings, often resisting the idea of attaching specific narratives to his works. He believed that images should speak for themselves, evoking emotions without needing explanations. However, his Black Triptychs are a rare exception. These pieces are deeply personal, born from grief and tragedy. At the heart of these triptychs is George Dyer, Bacon's longtime lover and artistic muse. Dyer had a troubled past, growing up in a rough environment and turning to crime before crossing paths with Bacon in the early 1960s. Though unsophisticated in the art world, Dyer was devoted to Bacon, attending all of his exhibitions and frequently accompanying him on travels to Paris. Their relationship, however, was tumultuous, strained by Dyer's struggles with alcoholism and feelings of inadequacy. In October 1971, just 2 days before the opening of Bacon's major retrospective at the Grand Palais in Paris, Dyer took his own life in their hotel suite. While Bacon was busy celebrating one of the highest points of his career, his lover was dying in the adjacent room. The event haunted Bacon, and he processed his grief through the Black Triptychs. These paintings depict different angles of Dyer's final moments, one from Dyer's perspective in his hotel room, one from Bacon's side, and one showing the aftermath. The dark, distorted imagery captures the weight of loss, guilt, and inevitability, making these triptychs some of Bacon's most emotionally charged works. He later admitted they served as a form of catharsis, a way to cope with the tragedy that had shaken him so profoundly. Though Bacon created many paintings exploring violence, anguish, and mortality, the Black Triptychs stand out as his most deeply personal works, both a tribute to his lost lover and an expression of the pain that followed. Two Tahitian Women. Paul Gauguin is often celebrated for his colorful and exotic paintings of Tahiti, portraying a vision of untouched paradise. His work, Two Tahitian Women, is a prime example, featuring two native women with calm expressions, holding fruit in a lush tropical setting. However, behind these serene depictions lies a much more unsettling reality. Gauguin traveled to Tahiti in the 1890s, seeking inspiration away from European society. He envisioned the island as a primitive paradise, a common colonial-era fantasy. However, Tahiti was already heavily influenced by French rule, and Gauguin's portrayal of the local people often reflected his own idealized notions rather than reality. The women in his paintings were not just artistic subjects, they were often individuals he formed relationships with, some of whom were much younger than him. Gauguin's time in Tahiti was marked by controversy. He built a home he called the House of Pleasure, where he lived an indulgent lifestyle. His personal writings and letters suggest a view of Tahiti that was shaped more by his own desires than by an understanding of its culture. Additionally, he suffered from health issues that, according to historical accounts, may have impacted the local population. When viewing Two Tahitian Women today, the painting may seem like a peaceful tropical scene, but its context raises important ethical questions. The romanticized imagery of Tahitian life in Gauguin's work is inseparable from the more troubling aspects of his personal history. This has led to ongoing debates about how we interpret and discuss art that is both visually stunning and morally complex. The Charnel House. Pablo Picasso is widely recognized for Guernica, his haunting 1937 masterpiece depicting the aftermath of a bombing during the Spanish Civil War. The chaotic composition, filled with distorted figures and fragmented perspectives, serves as a powerful anti-war statement, capturing the horror and suffering of innocent civilians. Less well-known but equally harrowing is the Charnel House, painted around 1944, often considered a spiritual successor to Guernica. While Picasso was not always overtly political in his early career, the devastation of the Spanish Civil War and later World War II deeply affected him. The Charnel House was inspired by real events, the brutal murder of a Republican family in their home during the war. The title itself refers to a vault or ossuary used to store human remains, emphasizing the gruesome reality of war's impact on ordinary people. At first, the painting might be hard to understand because of its abstract style. But when you look closer, you can see twisted, overlapping bodies lying on top of each other, their faces filled with pain. The use of only black, white, and gray makes the scene feel even more cold and tragic. Like Guernica, the Charnel House doesn't show one specific event, but instead represents the horrors of war in general. The broken, jumbled shapes reflect the confusion and suffering of people caught in violence, forcing the viewer to piece together what happened. Even today, Picasso's painting is a powerful reminder that war's true cost isn't about winning or losing, it's about the lives that are destroyed. The Driskill Hotel Portrait. Nestled in Austin, Texas, the historic Driskill Hotel is famed for its opulent decor and ghostly lore, but no story is more haunting than that of its infamous portrait of a young girl. Painted in the late 19th century, the artwork depicts 4-year-old Samantha Houston, daughter of U.S. Senator Temple Leah Houston, who tragically died in the hotel in 1886. Legend claims she was chasing a ball down the grand staircase when she slipped, tumbling to her death. Her spirit, however, is said to linger, not in the halls, but within the painting itself. Guests and staff have reported unsettling phenomena, the girl's eyes seemingly following viewers, her expression shifting from innocence to sorrow or even anger when observed too long. Some claim the portrait's background darkens inexplicably, as if absorbing the room's light. Paranormal investigators speculate the artist unintentionally captured Samantha's soul mid-trauma, binding her to the canvas. Others believe her spirit clings to the hotel, using the painting as a conduit. The Driskill's staff have allegedly moved the portrait multiple times, only for it to reappear on the 4th-floor landing, the site of her fatal fall. Visitors who dare snap photos sometimes capture glowing orbs or shadowy distortions around the frame. Louis Wain, the eccentric British artist famed for popularizing anthropomorphic cats in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is a figure shrouded in both whimsy and tragedy. His cheerful, wide-eyed feline illustrations, dressed in waistcoats, sipping tea, or playing instruments, charmed Victorian England. But Wain's later work reveals a disturbing metamorphosis, one that mirrors his spiral into schizophrenia and raises unsettling questions about art, madness, and perception. Wain's life unraveled after the death of his wife Emily from breast cancer in 1886. Already prone to erratic behavior, he grew increasingly reclusive and paranoid, eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia in his 50s. As his mental state fractured, so did his art. His once charming cats morphed into feverish, kaleidoscopic hallucinations, their fur exploding into fractal patterns, their eyes glowing with manic intensity, and their bodies dissolving into jagged, psychedelic abstractions. Art historians often present these works as a chronological map of his deteriorating mind, though some debate the exact timeline. What makes Wain's story so haunting is the mystery around it. Did he paint these colorful, trippy cats as part of an artistic style, or were they a glimpse into his troubled mind? Some believe his later works, made while he was in a mental hospital, show his struggle to make sense of his fears, turning his beloved cats into frightening versions of his paranoia. Others think the bright, swirling patterns reflect the confusion and overwhelming feelings of his illness, pulling viewers into his world. Sadly, Wain died broke in a psychiatric hospital in 1939, and some warn against romanticizing his struggles. Amedeo Modigliani's portrait of Jeanne Hébuterne is a haunting depiction of his lover and muse, but its beauty is overshadowed by the tragic story behind it. Modigliani, an Italian painter known for his elongated figures and melancholic portraits, met Jeanne Hébuterne in 1917. She was a young art student from a conservative bourgeois family, and despite fierce opposition from her parents, she fell deeply in love with Modigliani. Their relationship was passionate but tumultuous, marked by poverty, illness, and the artist's self-destructive tendencies. Modigliani, already suffering from tuberculosis, was also addicted to alcohol and drugs, further deteriorating his health. Jeanne became Modigliani's most frequent model, and Portrait of Jeanne Hébuterne, 1918, is one of the many paintings in which he immortalized her. In this particular piece, she is depicted with a long, graceful neck, soft, sorrowful eyes, and an expression of quiet resignation. The muted colors and gentle brushstrokes create a sense of intimacy, but there's an underlying sadness in her gaze, as if she's aware of the inevitable tragedy awaiting her. By 1919, Jeanne was pregnant with their second child, but Modigliani's health was rapidly failing. He had never sought proper medical treatment for his tuberculosis, and years of substance abuse had worsened his condition. In January 1920, at just 35 years old, he succumbed to tubercular meningitis. His death devastated Jeanne, who was only 21 years old at the time. Overcome with grief, she returned to her parents' home. Less than 2 days later, unable to bear the loss of the man she loved, Jeanne Hébuterne threw herself out of a fifth-floor window, herself and their unborn child. Jeanne's family, ashamed of her relationship with Modigliani, initially refused to bury her beside him. She was laid to rest separately, but nearly a decade later, she was finally moved to Père Lachaise Cemetery, where she now lies next to Modigliani. The inscription on her tomb reads, "Devoted companion to the extreme sacrifice." The painting captures the quiet sorrow that defined Jeanne's short life, making it not just a work of art, but a relic of one of the most tragic romances in art history. Edvard Munch's The Dead Mother is one of his most disturbing works, a deeply personal manifestation of childhood trauma and the lingering specter of death. The painting is rooted in Munch's own tragic past. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was just 5 years old, and his beloved sister Sophie succumbed to the same disease when he was 14. These devastating losses haunted him throughout his life, shaping his art into a vessel of grief, anxiety, and existential dread. In the painting, a pale, lifeless woman lies in bed, her face partially obscured by the pillow, while a child stands in the foreground with wide, hollow eyes and hands pressed against her ears. The most unsettling aspect of the image is the child's gaze. It appears both vacant and accusatory, staring directly at the viewer as if frozen in an eternal moment of horror. The room is shadowy, suffocating in its bleak atmosphere, with heavy curtains enclosing the scene like a funeral shroud. The mother's rigid body seems unnaturally still, while the child, though physically present, feels ghostly, almost unreal. The painting conveys not just the sorrow of loss, but the sheer terror of a child confronted with death. The child covering her ears suggests an attempt to shut out the unbearable reality, yet the scene remains inescapable. Some interpretations suggest that the child represents Munch himself, trapped in the psychological torment of his mother's death. Others see it as a haunting vision of grief's lasting grip, where even in death, the mother's presence dominates the room, leaving the living in a state of perpetual despair. Munch's fascination with illness and mortality was central to his work. His father, a deeply religious man, instilled in him a fear of divine punishment, making death not just a tragic event, but an ever-present specter looming over his life. His own struggles with mental illness, alcoholism, and anxiety further fueled his obsession with suffering, which he famously explored in The Scream and other works. The Dead Mother is perhaps one of his most unsettling pieces because it captures the raw, unfiltered terror of loss through the eyes of a child who cannot yet comprehend death but feels its suffocating weight nonetheless. Thomas Eakins' The Gross Clinic is one of the most shocking and talked about paintings in American art. It shows the harsh reality of surgery in the 1800s, a time when operations were done without modern tools or pain relief. Unlike older paintings that made medicine look clean and heroic, this one is raw and intense, filled with blood, pain, and the serious focus of doctors at work. The painting was so shocking at the time that it was rejected from the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition for being too grotesque, with critics calling it butcher's work rather than art. The painting depicts the famed surgeon Dr. Samuel Gross performing a real-life operation on a young patient at Jefferson Medical College. The boy was undergoing a procedure to remove infected bone caused by osteomyelitis, a common but often fatal disease in an era before antibiotics. Eakins, known for his obsessive dedication to realism, meticulously observed actual surgeries to capture every detail: the glistening blood on the scalpel, the exposed flesh, and the tense focus of the doctors. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Gross Clinic is the stark contrast between the cold efficiency of the medical team and the raw human suffering of the boy and his mother. Dr. Gross, illuminated by a dramatic beam of light, stands in command, his blood-stained hand gesturing as he lectures to students in the background. Meanwhile, the mother cowers in the shadows, her face contorted in anguish. The division between scientific progress and personal horror is at the heart of the painting's unsettling power. Though the young patient in the painting did not survive the operation, Dr. Gross himself was considered a pioneer in medicine, known for his resistance to antiseptic techniques, which were just beginning to be introduced at the time. Ironically, his opposition to sterilization methods may have contributed to the high mortality rates of such surgeries. Eakin's decision to depict this moment so graphically made many uncomfortable, as it forced viewers to confront the brutal reality of medical procedures before the era of modern anesthesia and hygiene. The painting's rejection from the Centennial exhibition was a devastating blow to Eakins, who believed he had created a masterpiece. It was instead relegated to a medical display, dismissed by art critics as too morbid. But over time, it was seen as an important and realistic look at both the struggles and progress of medicine. Today, it is considered one of the greatest American paintings ever made, though it is still just as unsettling as when it was first revealed. Egon Schiele's The Family is a powerful and heartbreaking painting about love, loss, and death. It was created in the final months of Schiele's life during the Spanish flu pandemic, a disease that would soon take him, his pregnant wife Edith, and their unborn child. In the painting, Schiele sits at the top with Edith in the center. Her expression seems distant, as if she is already fading away. Below her is a child, curled up but somehow separate from them. This child is symbolic, representing the baby they would never get to meet. The way Schiele arranged the figures is important. He sits above, both protective and distant. Edith is in the middle, the heart of the family, while the child at the bottom appears small and vulnerable. Even though they are physically close, there is a quiet feeling of separation, as if death has already started pulling them apart. Schiele's unique style makes the painting feel even more intense. The figures have long, stretched limbs and tense bodies, making them look fragile and uneasy. The dark, empty background surrounds them, creating a feeling of both closeness and loneliness. Schiele painted the family while the Spanish flu was spreading rapidly, killing millions. In October 1918, Edith became sick and died just days later. Schiele followed soon after, passing away 3 days later. Today, The Family is seen as one of Schiele's most haunting works, not just because of how it looks, but because of the real tragedy behind it. It is a final, sorrowful reflection of an artist who seemed to sense that his time was running out. Portrait of a Madman by Théodore Géricault is part of a series commissioned by psychiatrist Dr. Étienne Jean Georget. This haunting work depicts asylum patients with stark realism, rejecting romanticization. Created during Géricault's own decline, battling depression after backlash from the Raft of the Medusa and personal tragedies, the portraits reveal raw humanity, contrasting 19th century society's brutal treatment of mental illness. Géricault immersed himself in asylums, capturing patients' isolation and despair, mirroring his inner turmoil. Dr. Georget sought to link facial features to mental states, via physiognomy, a pseudoscience. But Géricault's artistry transcended clinical study, offering empathy in an era that stigmatized mental health as moral weakness. The artist died at 32 in 1824, ravaged by physical and mental illness. The burning of the Sanjo Palace is a chilling section of the Heiji Monogatari Emaki, an illustrated scroll narrating the violent Heiji rebellion of 1159. This political coup saw samurai loyal to Fujiwara no Nobuyori and Minamoto no Yoshitomo seize Kyoto and abduct Emperor Nijo. In a terrifying show of force, they torched the Sanjo Palace, reducing it to ashes while slaughtering noblemen, officials, and even defenseless civilians. The painting captures this massacre in haunting detail: men trampled underfoot, nobles executed in the streets, and women throwing themselves into wells to escape sexual violence. The chaotic, almost cinematic composition preserves a rare pre-modern depiction of war crimes, unfiltered and unapologetically brutal. Old Man's Death is a haunting painting by Hungarian artist Laszlo Mednyánszky, who was active during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It portrays an elderly man on his deathbed, enveloped in darkness, with the faint glow of a candle illuminating his weary face. A shadowy figure, representing death itself, looms ominously over him, reinforcing the painting's unsettling tone. Mednyánszky's signature blend of naturalism and symbolism enhances the melancholic atmosphere, making this piece one of his most striking works. Today, It is regarded as a masterpiece of Hungarian Art Nouveau. Roman Charity. At first glance, Roman Charity appears to be a scene of compassion and sacrifice, yet its unsettling nature lies in the unusual relationship it portrays. The painting, depicted by multiple artists throughout history, most notably by Peter Paul Rubens, Caravaggio, and Jean-Baptiste Greuze, illustrates an ancient Roman tale recorded by the historian Valerius Maximus. The story follows a man named Simon who is sentenced to death by starvation in prison. His daughter, Pero, visits him daily and, in an act of extreme devotion, secretly breastfeeds him to keep him alive. When the jailers discover this shocking act, they are so moved by her selflessness that they grant Simon his freedom. The scene is meant to embody ultimate familial loyalty and self-sacrifice, but to modern audiences, it carries an unmistakable sense of unease. The stark contrast between Pero's nurturing role as a daughter and the unnatural act she performs creates an eerie tension, making the painting both emotionally powerful and deeply disturbing. While historically celebrated as a symbol of virtue, Roman Charity has also been interpreted as unsettling, even grotesque. The intimate and taboo nature of the act forces viewers to confront the extremes of human survival and devotion, making it one of the most controversial and haunting subjects in classical art. When Claude Monet's paintings were first shown in the early 1920s, many critics dismissed them, mocking his blurry and unusual style. Today, however, Monet is seen as one of the greatest artists in history, known for his unique use of color and light. But a surprising theory suggests that his famous style may not have been a deliberate artistic choice. It may have been caused by his failing eyesight. According to the British Journal of Medical Practice, researcher Anna Groiner studied how Monet's cataracts affected his vision and, in turn, his paintings. As his eyesight worsened, colors became less clear, and his paintings became hazier, with stronger reds and yellows. This wasn't necessarily an intentional shift. He may have simply been painting the way he saw the world. Monet was terrified of cataract surgery, especially since two other artists had undergone similar procedures and suffered poor results. Despite his fears, Monet finally agreed to the surgery in 1923. According to The Guardian, removing the lens of the eye, as this procedure does, can sometimes allow a person to see ultraviolet light. This could explain why his Water Lilies series, painted after the operation, had a much stronger blue tint. This theory changes how we see Monet's work, not just as an artistic experiment, but possibly as a reflection of how his world appeared to him in his later years. Paul Delaroche's The Execution of Lady Jane Grey. It captures the final moments of Lady Jane Grey, a young girl who was only 16 years old when she was executed in 1554. Despite being Queen of England for just 9 days, her life ended in tragedy, making her one of history's most sorrowful figures. Delaroche's painting doesn't just depict an execution, it immerses the viewer in a scene of innocence, helplessness, and doom. The painting shows Lady Jane in the Tower of London, moments before her beheading. She is dressed in a flowing white gown, symbolizing her purity and youth. Her eyes are blindfolded, and her hands reach out uncertainly, searching for the execution block. A man, possibly the executioner's assistant, gently guides her towards it. His posture suggests hesitation, as if he himself is uneasy about taking part in the death of someone so young. To the right, two of Jane's ladies-in-waiting are overcome with grief, one burying her face in her hands, while the other seems frozen in shock. The executioner, standing silently, holds the massive axe that will soon take Jane's life. The background is dark and shadowy, giving the scene a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Lady Jane Grey's story is one of betrayal and power struggles. She was the great niece of Henry VIII and had a claim to the English throne through her Protestant lineage. Dying, he and his advisors wanted to prevent his Catholic half-sister, Mary Tudor, from becoming queen. To achieve this, they declared Jane Grey the rightful ruler. However, Jane never wanted to be queen. She was a highly intelligent and deeply religious girl who was more interested in her studies than in politics. Unfortunately, she had no choice. She was placed on the throne by powerful noblemen who sought to control England through her. Her reign lasted just 9 days. The people of England overwhelmingly supported Mary Tudor, and Jane was quickly overthrown. Mary, now Queen Mary I, had to decide what to do with her young cousin. At first, she showed mercy and kept Jane imprisoned in the Tower of London. However, a Protestant rebellion soon broke out in Jane's name, even though she had nothing to do with it. This convinced Mary that as long as Jane lived, she would be a threat to the throne. In February 1554, Lady Jane Grey was sentenced to death. Delaroque's painting captures the emotional weight of this moment. Unlike other historical execution paintings, which often focus on grandeur or political drama, this one is deeply personal. Jane is not shown as a queen, but as a frightened, innocent girl who was caught in the ruthless world of politics. The soft light on her pale skin contrasts with the dark surroundings, emphasizing her vulnerability. The blindfold adds to the horror. She cannot even see what is happening, making her death feel even more cruel. When the execution of Lady Jane Grey was first displayed in 1834, it shocked audiences. Many believed it was one of the most realistic and emotional historical paintings ever made. However, the painting is not entirely accurate. For example, Jane was actually executed outdoors, not in a dark chamber, and she likely wasn't blindfolded. But Delaroche wasn't aiming for strict historical accuracy. He wanted to capture the tragedy and sorrow of Jane's fate.